Hi everyone, it's Annalisa and Bret from C.A.C. Global Solutions. We're aircraft management specialists, and with C.A.C. Global Solutions, we offer a number of different services from aircraft management, transition aircraft projects, quality audits, and AOC startups, and much more. We are here today for another episode of Storytime with Bret, where Bret is going to tell us about one of the experiences that he encountered during his career in aviation. What do you have for us?
Thanks, Annalisa. Well, today it's kind of I think they're all interesting ones, but this particular one was a maintenance input visit for a Bombardier Challenger 604 that had been in for a fairly substantial maintenance check. And normally these maintenance stories, I mean, it's all technical, right? But this one has some input from the pilots as well, from the flight crew. So I thought it's kind of interesting. So this one particular aircraft was input for this maintenance check, and everything was done. It was the day before it was supposed to be released and put back into service. So all of the work was accomplished. All of the package had been not quite signed off yet, but it was all closed up, and they were in the final aspects of closing off the work package. The maintenance facility was. In a lot of these maintenance checks, you take off all of the books and loose equipment that's on board the aircraft just for safekeeping, and it's usually locked up. And then just prior to dispatching the aircraft, the whoever's responsible, in this case it was the flight crew, came down the day before, and they were starting to put all of the books, the log books and aircraft flight manual, operations manual, everything back in the aircraft. And of course they're doing all of their own walkarounds and such as well. And it was interesting because the aircraft is basically, there wasn't really any work happening to the aircraft anymore at this point. But the flight crew, they were doing their checks and such, and they had power on the aircraft in the hangar, and they were poking their heads around in the wheel wells and all over the place, in the equipment bays and wherever they could get access to readily. And just so happened, one of the flight crew was in the cockpit, in the pilot's seat, and he had hydraulic power on the aircraft, and he's doing checks for free motion of the flight controls. So he's got the control column and he's moving it back and forth and side to side, and he doesn't like it. I mean, this is where you get some perspective differences, some intricacies on how people perceive things, right? Like a maintainer, you get the aircraft in the hangar and you disassemble it and you put it back together, and then you do your checks, and what you would experience may not be what the normal flight crew would experience. Now, particularly with a corporate aviation department where the flight crew are the same crew that operate the aircraft all of the time, they become quite intimate with the aircraft. They know how it feels, they know what it does, they know what to expect, when, how, and everything. And the flight crew, this particular pilot, he was moving the controls back and forth, the yoke back and forth and side to side, and didn't feel right to him. Now, of course, if maintenance had disturbed anything having to do with flight control, they would have checked it for sense of operation. The affected flight controls move in the right direction as in respect to the controls, and well, they would have checked the safety of the control for anything that was disturbed, but also just for the feel and smoothness of it as well, right? And to a maintenance provider, to an engineer, doing this and this may feel normal, but to the pilot it didn't. He was used to flying the aircraft all the time, and he just didn't like the way it felt, and he thought he heard something. So he called maintenance over, and he got maintenance convinced that it didn't sound and feel quite right. It wasn't bad, but it just didn't seem quite right. So for the better part of a couple hours, they sat there turning the controls and moving them back and forth, and and they couldn't put their finger on it. They had somebody outside going up and down the fuselage listening to where they thought the sound might be. And after about an hour and a half, 2 hours of trying to narrow this down, the aircraft developed a hydraulic leak just out of
Oh.
nowhere. Yeah. So all of a sudden it's like, what's going on, right? So they turned the hydraulics off and they opened the panels up in the area where the leak seemed to be coming from. And what had happened is there was a control cable that had been routed over top of a hydraulic line when it should have been routed underneath the hydraulic line.
Oh.
So in going back and trying to put all of the pieces back together, there was a control cable that had been replaced,
Mm-hmm.
and they rerouted it wrong. And then they tensioned it and everything. And although the cable hadn't been reversed, so you had the right sense of operation, and it went over a smooth hydraulic line, so there was some abnormal resistance, but nothing that the maintenance crew picked up on. It was the flight crew that picked up on this. And what had happened is with all of the movement over time, the cable cut into the hydraulic line.
Hmm.
And so,
I mean, over time, in the 2 hours
in the
that you
2 hours,
guys
right,
did the
in a
test.
short time, right. So, I mean, very interesting. I mean, the cable tensions are typically fairly high in these type of controls in these areas. And so basically you had a saw blade working back and forth over
Mm-hmm.
top this hydraulic line until, I mean, it hadn't cut it right off, but enough that there was hydraulic fluid escaping from it.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, in flight, the flight home would have been probably 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, you're not moving the control all of the time, but at what point in flight would this have caused complete failure? You
Yeah.
know? So it was a good thing that they caught it, and it was an interesting one.
Yeah, very interesting story, because for me there are a couple of aspects. First of all, one that we talked about in our webinars, where it's important, the interaction between the pilot, the maintenance, and the airworthiness management is very important. There must be a cooperation in managing the aircraft. And the other aspect is that flight begins on the ground, actually,
Right.
because thanks to the checks that they did, they find out this problem. And the other part is the fact that, you know, the pilot was used to fly that aircraft. He knew it, and he knew there was something wrong. It's like
Right.
when you go around with your car, you have driven your car for a long time, and you know when something is not right. And
Right.
this is another important part. In particular in corporate aviation, my experience is it's a good thing when you have the same flight crew, because they really get to know the aircraft very well.
Well, they do. There's a downside to that too, though,
Mm.
that I've also seen where we had 2 aircraft and we had 6 pilots for those 2 aircraft. And but typically the 2 pilots would always fly the same aircraft, and then they would
Mm-hmm.
change one pilot out once in a while. For the 6 meant that we had 2 spare pilots for the 2 aircraft. But once in a while we would switch airplanes on them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was quite interesting because the guys that flew the aircraft all the time, they would come back from a trip and you'd ask them how everything was, and they'd, oh, it's all great. No problems? No, everything was great. And then you switch the pilots, and the 2 pilots come back the next day and the first time out on this aircraft, and they'd say, no, we've got all kinds of problems. But then you talk to the original crew that was on the aircraft, and you'd say, well, what about this and what about that? And they'd say, oh yeah, but we just learned to live with it. It's the airplane, right? So yeah, it is an interesting aspect when you have the same crew on all the time, but there's, in my mind, some value in mixing it up a little bit too. So.
Yeah, well, everything is about perception, right? So, but I have another question under a maintenance point of view. So you said that a cable was replaced and it was routed in kind of the wrong way. So do you remember in that case, or do you know if there was like a finding opened against what happened under maintenance perspective? So that, there could have been an assessment on why the cable was routed in a different way, and
Right.
make sure that that wouldn't happen in the future.
Yeah, I know that they did open internal occurrence report. I'm not certain whether there was like a quality audit finding or anything against it. But you bring up an interesting point, because it's very common practice that when you replace something like a control cable, typically you tie a string to the end of it and you withdraw the cable from wherever it runs, and then when you put the new cable in, you pull the string back and it pulls the cable back the exact same path that it went out. But sometimes when you're in for a big maintenance check, different things are apart at the same time, right? So I didn't actually catch what the situation was. It could have been that they had a hydraulic line disconnected while the cable was being replaced, or I'm not sure what the situation was. But yeah, it's something that you need to pay very close attention to. Cable runs, I've actually found on a Twin Otter aircraft that had been in service for several years since its last check, since its last major check, some control cables in the leading edge of the wing that were twisted around each other, and they'd been like that for some time. And I mean, you wouldn't normally see that, because the area where it was twisted was between a long span where there was a pulley before and a pulley after. And unless you get a mirror and you get in there and a light and you look very closely, and it's a bit of a strain on the eye, because you've got the parallax of the mirror, which means also when you look down the mirror, of course, you're looking at things in reverse potentially, and with the light shining on it, sometimes you really have to gain the perspective of what you're looking at, right? But when you see it, it's unmistakable. So, but in my mind, absolutely, you need, wherever possible, and it's possible, maybe very difficult, but it's possible to get a good look at something. And I mean, it might be that you even want to send a borescope in an area that you can't see, because that gets you so much closer and with proper light to the area you're looking at. But I mean, the consequences could be devastating.
Oh, of course, of course. Yeah, my point was really about the quality part. So when something happens, you need to understand why that happened, right? And that means that, okay, was the maintenance instruction correct? If they were, okay, so it's not a problem with the maintenance instruction, it's the problem of how the job was done. So why was the job done in that way?
Right.
So that there can be a root cause analysis, and you avoid, hopefully, this kind of mistake in the future. This is why I put a lot of emphasis in reporting the defect.
Absolutely. This is what occurrence reporting is all about, right? I mean, it could be that the manual is followed to the T, but it was somebody's slip up or whatever. But that, like you say, that needs to be looked at and determined, because, like you say, if it is something that could easily be prevented, then maybe a side note in the maintenance manual is worthwhile. But those are things that need to be reported and need to be analyzed and reported to the authority and also to the type certificate holder too.
Yeah, exactly. That was my point, because sometimes, not very often, but once in a while, it happens that maybe you have a service bulletin and the instruction in the service bulletin is not correct. It can happen.
We've seen it ourselves firsthand.
Exactly.
More than once. So,
exactly. So that was a good story. I like that. I like when there is a good interaction between pilots and maintenance and all of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been on the other side too, where a pilot comes to you with a problem that isn't really a problem. So you have to listen to people. Of course. I mean, like you say, with my car, I've had a problem for some time. We both know about this, and we've had it to different mechanics, and they can never see anything, but we know it's there.
We know the problem is there. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for this story. It was very interesting. If you guys like this kind of content, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to know more about us, go to cacglobalsolutions.com. And thank you so much for watching, and bye for now.